Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session here, focused on Atlassian Cloud and disaster recovery. And the focus of the session is really about building a plan. Obviously, you've probably done a lot of research on backup vendors. Do I leverage, something that I build myself, Atlassian's native tooling, a third-party vendor like HYCU, or you know, what really the challenges sometimes that we see is organizations really don't have the right run books and the right plans when it comes to data protection, when it comes to DR. And so the entire focus of today's session is going to be how do you build an actual plan and what does that look like in a 30, 60, 90 to make sure that your organization, whether you are migrating or you already have migrated to the cloud, that you are, ready to rumble, that you are secure, that you are protected and always recoverable as well. So the focus of this session and this agenda today, everything's going to be fully recorded on demand. So you will have access to the deck, you will have access to the presentation as well. And so the agenda that we have right now is going to be focused on, in the next 20 minutes, we're going to talk through a few things. Atlassian has shipped an incredible amount of product, a lot of updates, a lot of changes, but the way that they require you to protect that data has not changed by any means. So in the next 20 minutes, we're going to go over the shared responsibility model, what it covers, what it doesn't. We are going to talk through, in 2026, what are the actual failure modes, meaning what are ways that you can be disrupted or lose your data. And we're going to talk through setting actual targets, meaning how often am I taking my backups? How often am I recovering the data? And then we're going to walk through that 30, 60, 90 to exactly be able to cover. And every single one of you walks away with an exact plan on doing so. So a few of you maybe are thinking, or, who is Haiku? How do I pronounce that? Haiku stands for Hybrid Cloud Uptime. We've been protecting the crown jewels of organizations for years. We have thousands of customers all over the world who trust us to be able to protect their data no matter where it is, Atlassian being a very, very key priority for us as well. And of course, we're also part of the Atlassian Ventures ecosystem. We help both commercial organizations, but also federal organizations and public sector as well be able to protect their data. And what we're really, really proud of here is we've been doing this for a long time. We are the de facto leader in SaaS data protection and cloud data protection. And so, what you're going to experience here for the next few minutes is going to be really years of knowledge, years of customer meetings, enabling and helping customers themselves be able to protect and make sure that they have a plan that is established and they have the right run book. So we hope to share this wisdom, these experiences with you, and that you get value out of it as well. But what I want to talk to you a little bit too is most of you on this call are not just responsible for Atlassian. You're most likely responsible for a lot of applications within IT. Maybe you're responsible for IT as a whole. And so the entire point of this discussion today is really shifting that mindset from where we were 10 to 15 years ago. And in that world, everything was hosted on premises. Your Git repo, your ticket management, your knowledge base, file systems, everything was hosted on premise. So if you were an IT manager back then, you were the king or the queen of that castle. And if anything happened to that data, well, you were protecting all of it because they were all virtual machines or physical machines. And what really started to change was the fragmentation of this data. And all of these systems of record that you saw that used to be hosted by and owned by you, just like Atlassian, are now all of a sudden sitting somewhere as a service. And what that means is that you go from this kind of monolithic entity that you can protect in a uniform way to I've got over 100 SaaS applications. Atlassian, their cloud applications being part of that number. I've also got multiple public clouds that we're using as an organization. And none of that is even discussing the fact that you also now have AI co-pilots and agents on top of those applications, and your organization is most likely building its own systems as well. And so we live in a world where fully monolithic, standardized security protection governance to my data is absolutely everywhere, full heterogeneous environments, and I need to get a better understanding of how to protect it. And so one of the biggest dangers of still having this everything is hosted on-prem mindset is this misconception where the moment that I migrate from, Jira Server or data center to cloud, I no longer am hosting it. I'm no longer patching it. I'm no longer provisioning VMs. I'm no longer responsible for that. And what that makes me think very logically is, well, Atlassian's got it covered. It's their responsibility. They're hosting it for me. Why wouldn't they recover my data? And what we realized, and we ran a huge study last year with over 500, IT leaders across the world. It was the State of SaaS Resilience Report. And in this report, we found a massive misconception, which is that 66% still think that responsibility for data protection lives with the vendor. But the reality is that although maybe philosophically that's what you believe would happen, the reality is that Atlassian is just like every other SaaS and cloud vendor. Think Microsoft 365, think Azure, think Google Cloud, AWS. They all follow the shared responsibility model. Now, the diagrams and imagery might always look a little different, but it's the same concept. And what it means is that Atlassian is responsible for the system. They're responsible for making sure that it's available, that you can log in, that it's secure, that you can access this information. But it's impossible for them to understand, hey, did you mean to delete those assets? Did you mean to delete that ticket? It's impossible. So what they provide is this shared responsibility where, hey, we have backups, we provide DR for the service. But you as the tenant have to be responsible for that data. And I'll give you an example of kind of how that works. Think of it as a parking garage. You're in a parking garage. When you go in, what do you expect? I drive my car. I expect to pay. I expect the lights to be on, and I expect my car to still be in the garage when I come back. But if I leave my window down, if I hit the car somewhere, if I hit another car, it's not the garage's responsibility, it's mine. It's the same thing when it comes to your tenancy within Atlassian Cloud. But then you're thinking, hey, we've made it really hard for somebody to delete data. And that's the case. Every good Jira admin does a great job of making sure that people can't delete anything and managing permissions the right way. But there's so many different ways to change, modify, even permanently delete data in Atlassian that is really, really important that as you build out this plan, you have a very good understanding of what are those components. And what I mean by that is, well, still understand the risk of human error. Even you as an admin might still be deleting things. It does happen. It happens all the time. We get those calls. Depending on the permissions of your marketplace apps, it can go in and delete something on your behalf. We've seen it many times where an automation is written incorrectly or it's misinterpreted and it goes and deletes a bunch of assets. Like we've seen this time and time again. And in fact, we're going to talk a little bit more later about AI agents, Rovo, and what that means, because that's a very, very, very big new productivity unlock, but it's super important that you are aware of what can happen if you don't deploy it effectively. And there are many more use cases where you could potentially lose your data, whether it's a compromised administrator, somebody disgruntled in your organization, and even the, knock on wood, hopefully never happens, but outages and supply chain compromises that could happen to any SaaS service that's running in a public cloud like AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud. So it's really important to understand what applications am I using right now within Atlassian? How are they provisioned? Am I responsible for the administration? Do I have different departments who are administrators? And really start to map out the risk of where something could go wrong, because then you can really start to tune your recovery plans accordingly. Now, one thing that I want to talk about a little bit is a little bit more on the agent side of the house. What I mean by this is a new footprint. This is a new attack surface. This is a new area of incredible productivity gains and incredible risk. What I mean by that is, depending on how your organization administers this, by the way, it doesn't just mean Rovo. It could mean Copilot. It could mean, GitHub Copilot, Agentforce, and Salesforce. It's all the same thing. And one is they have incredible scope, especially if they're granted at the org level. The big, big difference between risk at the agentic level is the speed of it. What a human can do is very, very different than what a machine could do. So, think about what your automations are able to do and delete within a period of time. Extend that to the rest of your environment with something like Rovo. And the beauty of this is, it's always going to look legitimate because you gave it the right permission. So it's going to log and look like something that should have happened. And so what happens sometimes is if you write kind of the wrong set of instructions, you can end up missing out on the fact that you've deleted a pretty significant amount of data. And I'll actually share a little bit of that. Here's a very basic use case. Now, a lot of the organizations are going to have the right guardrails and controls, but the point here is when it comes to data protection, we see all forms of Murphy's Law. And you want to be able to make sure that the way that you configure Rovo, the permissions management, the service accounts, everything that you're using within Rovo is done correctly. Because here's a very benign example of what could happen when you are trying to archive resolve tickets. It could end up even deleting those tickets. And so the point here is that we're all learning as we speak around how to use these agents, especially agents with read and write permissions. And we have to use them because they bring so much productivity value to our organizations. We have to make sure that we understand the risk and that more importantly, if or when something goes wrong, we have the ability to also recover that data as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue monitoring for questions. I already see some questions here around the slide deck and recording. Yes, we will share the recording with you, and we will share the slide deck as well. We're more than happy to give you access to this PowerPoint because there are some good recovery plans here. But something that I just wanted to summarize here. There are many ways to lose access to data. There are many ways to change data. The biggest delta today is that this could happen at machine speed across your organization versus a human performing an action that leads to a deletion. So this is super, super critical. But what I want to share is when we look back at that survey that we did, if you remember, 60% of folks believe that it was the SaaS vendor's responsibility. When you continue asking these people who have ownership of applications, what we also saw was that for these SaaS applications like Atlassian or GitHub or Salesforce, organizations were very underprotected and very underprepared. What do I mean by that? Less than a third actually had a backup policy. What I mean by that is maybe they were manually exporting at a time, they were using this here and there, but none of them, or less than a third, had the ability to say, yes, every day we take a backup of this application. Less than a third said, hey, yes, we keep a copy outside of the SaaS application. And only a quarter said, hey, yeah, we've actually tested a recovery. So something I want to keep in mind here too is if you have a backup and you've never tested the recovery of that backup, then you don't have a backup. You have, a checkbox. But the reality is, in order to be truly prepared and truly resilient, you have to test your ability to recover as well. And I'm going to continue to monitor questions, so please feel free to continue adding them. So what I want to also mention here is it's very important to understand what you can and cannot do and the tooling that's available to you. So there's a whole analysis that we can provide on Atlassian backup and recovery and what it does. And of course, as a vendor, they have to do a great job of giving you at least some ability to back up and recover your data. But the point is that there are very severe limitations, especially when it comes to granular recovery and when it comes to things that you've maybe deleted a long time ago. So we'll share with you after this email a full breakdown of what the difference between an Atlassian native backup is and a third-party provider that is fully focused on enterprise class backup and recovery. But what I want to start talking to you now is the planning step. So regardless of your choice today of backup and recovery, we're just going to talk about a plan that you can designate to any backup strategy that you have, whether it's HYCU or not. And so the first thing that you want to make sure that you have very, very clear in your mind is, one, what are the scope of the applications or even spaces within Atlassian that I want to protect? How critical are they to me? How critical are they to customer interactions? And should I have any SLAs tied to them? So there's two things that you have to define. Your RPO, which is your recovery point objective, which is, hey, how often am I going to perform a backup? Because if I'm performing a backup every 2 days, then I'm by default saying, hey, I'm willing to lose 2 days worth of data. So you have to think through what can you live with or what's the most critical part of your organization. We have some customers who are taking a backup every hour, some customers who are taking a backup every day. It is your organization's choice to understand what the recovery point objective. But what's very important too is your recovery time objective. And what I mean by that is if you have a very, very significant project, you have something that's critical to customer information, and you need to be able to recover that information very quickly, but you have a solution that only allows you to re-import, then you are going to have an RTO issue, which is a recovery time objective. So you have to define this specific asset, this specific piece of information, we need to have it back in less than 2 hours. And you have to define that as part of your plans. So one, classify those applications by how critical are they. Even the spaces within those applications, you can fragment that. You want to always document what your recovery point is, your recovery time objective, And then you want to validate the target and actually say, okay, let's perform a restore. What happened then? And the reason this is so important is in on-prem, it's like very easy to determine the cost of a disruption from a DR perspective. You have your tier one VMs. Every organization, I've lived part of my career in disaster recovery and data replication, especially on premises. And when we spoke to organizations and asked them, like, what's the cost of an hour of downtime on a tier one VM? They would be able to tell you that very, very explicitly. It's very hard to answer that when within SaaS applications and you've isolated it. And so one critical thing to show here is, this number was part of the survey where there was a SaaS data unavailability incident, and it happened for over 5 days, and it led to $2 million in disruption loss for these customers on average. Now, every single organization is different. How you use these applications are very different. But the point is, you want to get to a point where you understand what the cost of downtime, whether in direct revenue or in productivity, is to your organization. And that's going to let you really easily tie your RPO and your RTO requirements as well. But something that's very, very critical here is regulation itself is raising the bar. We have a ton of customers in the EU and a ton of customers who are multinationals, and they have to abide by EU laws, whether that's NIS 2 or the Digital Operations Resilience Act, similar to what people call DORA. And DORA is super interesting because DORA took this problem statement of, hey, our entire financial ecosystem depends on a series of ICTs or SaaS applications that every single one of our vendors and customers depend on. Things like Atlassian, things like Git repositories, Microsoft 365, Azure, AWS, you name it. And what they realized was that if there are incidents, which there are, whether it's outages, supply chain compromise, you name it, they need to guarantee that these institutions themselves still have access to the data. So DORA has many, many, many articles, but it does go out of its way to really focus on data protection. Specifically, what you'll see is in Article 12, it'll state that you need to have backup policies for these systems. And it's also demanding this of the SaaS applications themselves, but you as an entity as well need to have a backup and recovery policy. And that means not only actually having a documentation of that policy, but also making sure that you can restore and recover that, and that you documented exactly how you're going to restore. And then even further, being able to say, where are you hosting this backup? Where are you hosting this information? And is it logically segregated from that source system? On premises, we all remember this. It's the 3-2-1 rule. You have 3 copies of your data, 2 media types, 1 offsite. But in reality, in SaaS, it became a little bit murky, and we all stopped following it for some reason. But it still applies, and DORA is really, really showcasing this for organizations. So one thing that I want to stress in your plan is where you determine that your backup lives is super consequential to the business. So one of the things that we always recommend is that you bring your own storage, that you have the ability to leverage your own storage for these backups, because then you have full control. You can determine how often you want to retain that data. You can determine where you want to retain that data. You can then determine how much security guardrails you want to include. You want to object lock these backups. And what's very, very important as well is that where you store your data could also determine whether you can access it or not after if there is an outage. So let's say there is a repeat of an outage and all of a sudden Confluence is down for a day. Can you access that critical information from your backups? That could be a very, very big game changer for an organization that's going through a blackout, especially things that we've already seen, for example, the US East incident. So the reality is when you rely on maybe the native tooling, if the system goes down, so does the backup data, and you have nothing that's readable or usable. So you have to think, where am I keeping these backups and how can I use them if something does go down? So that's a very, very critical decision as part of your runbooks to say, where am I keeping my backups? And what I really want to walk away today in this takeaway is walk you through specifically a 30, 60, 90-day plan. How do you close those gaps? So what I would ask, and ideally everyone does this a lot faster, but these are realistic timelines that you can set. First 30 days, understand what's inside of your systems. Understand what's critical, what's not critical. Not every single space is going to be tier one. You have to understand exactly what that means. Classify them by criticality or challenge members of your teams and different application owners to come to you with the criticality and set drafts, RPOs, and RTOs. The next thing you do is decide, well, am I going to continue with the strategy that I have? Am I going to evaluate a new strategy or vendor? And then what you want to do is be able to actually turn those backups on, test them. Do they meet your RPO requirements? Do they meet your storage requirements? And really start to write your run book out, because now you have a strategy and you have a command of what the business SLA is. And then what you really have to do is make sure that you can test and prove it. Run real restore tests. Do it at a high level. Do it for very granular activities, but run very real restore tests. Don't just check the box and say, hey, I have a backup policy. It was assigned. We're good. You really want to measure against RTO, and then you want to make sure that you can fix gaps and schedule these tests. Don't just you onboard a new solution or build a new strategy and then you test it once and then you move on. Make this a quarterly behavior. Make this as something that your organization does. You can run automations to do this, but it's very critical that you continue testing for peace of mind. And so what I want to mention here, and I'll share this checklist with everybody, offline, is go through that inventory and rank, set your targets, start protecting, recover, and test. So in that inventory and rank, you want to get very, very specific to understand down to very explicit projects and spaces, what's critical, what's non-critical. And if this is down for a certain period of time, what is the impact to my business? Whether that's in JSM, whether that's part of your CMDB, or it's part of your software development lifecycle, or if something's customer facing, then that kind of answers itself, right? So you want to be able to very granularly define, what am I protecting and why, and what can I live with? And you want to make sure that you don't miss out on some business critical data or workflows that are very, very valuable to your organization. Then set those RPOs. What's that data loss tolerance? What's the time to recover? What are the SLAs? How do I document those SLAs? And then how does this map to my compliance? And then what you really want to get into then is make sure that you can set that backup frequency, align it to your RPO. Pin the regions. You also want to make sure, where am I processing my backups? Where am I storing the data for these backups? And is that part of my data sovereignty strategy? And make sure that you can turn on immutability for this, and then confirm that everything is included in those backups. And this might be for some folks the most tedious or boring step, but there's many things that you can do with AI to really make it faster. But you want to make sure that you document everything. You want to document, what are the steps to perform a recovery? Who's the owner? What are the permissions needed? What's the validation step? If you've automated this, like, what you need a human in the loop, schedule these real tests with a real data owner. What I mean by that is, you do not want to be the only person in your organization who knows how to perform a restore. If you are on vacation, or multiple members are sick or on vacation, this needs to be accessible, documentable, and for people to be able to say, look, we know exactly how to perform this recovery. These are some of the very tedious details that could make a difference between you having access to your data in your organization and not doing so, and facing some disruptions. So to really summarize today's discussion, look, the shared responsibility model has not changed and will not change. You are responsible for your data within your tenancy of Atlassian Cloud. The ability for you to lose or modify data is faster than ever, and will only get faster as your organization gets more sophisticated in its use of AI. And backup alone is not a plan. You have to perform a restore. So the advice that I would provide here is, if there's one thing that you do today, is go take a look at one specific critical application and see if you can meet your SLAs already today. And if you can do so, then excellent. But the point is, this is a very, very important series of steps to take. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time. Today was a very kind of operational discussion, how to build a run book. We are here to help you do that any point in time. We are leaders in Atlassian data protection and SaaS data protection. And we've been doing this for thousands of organizations. And so we have a lot of expertise. So even if you want simply a consult to say, hey, what do you recommend? What have you learned? we're more than happy to spend that time with you. So I've added a couple of QR codes and links here. You can see our trust center. How is it that we approach security and data protection? You can see the applications that we can protect in our marketplace, and you can even test this out for free as well and validate those applications as well. So I want to thank you all so much for your time, for your attention today. We're going to share the deck. We're going to share everything that you have. Please send an email or a note to us afterwards, but we'll make sure to share this presentation with you. So thank you all so much and have an excellent day.